I thought it was about time I helped my dad clean up and organize his shop. I wanted to start in this area where we have some of our cutting, drilling, and grinding tools. My dad is about 75 now, and 3 years ago, he found this metal building on Craigslist. The previous owners had bought the building, had it delivered to their property, and never put it up. So he drug it home, had a pad poured, and then with the help of one of his buddies, they got the building put up. I've been wanting to build some sort of wall over the white insulation to help protect it when I'm grinding or sanding metal. It seems to be pretty fragile and seems to tear really easy. I wanted to take the time to clean the area up before I built the wall. First, I cut my pressure-treated sill plate to length to fit between the two steel columns. I needed to notch both ends of my sill plate to fit around the anchor bolts for the columns. So I used a piece of scrap 2x4 to figure out my measurements, and then I transferred those over to the pressure-treated sill plate. I used a hole saw so that I'd have a nice curve on the back side of my notches. I did this on both ends of the sill plate. I then took the 2x4 over to the bandsaw and finished clearing out those notches. When we built a small mezzanine in the shop, we had a local lumber company deliver this load of 2x6s. After we got home and saw how bad they were, we rejected the load and they came out and delivered another load of 2x6s but didn't want these back. So they've been sitting around and I'm hoping I can dig through to find some good enough that I can rip down into some decent lumber for 2x4 studs. You can see just how bad some of the weighing is on these 2x6s, but I should be able to rip them down into some decent studs for this project. I started out by ripping about an inch off the better side of these 2x6s. Once that was done, I adjusted my saw for the width of these 2x4s and then finished off ripping the worst side of the weighing off. Next, I marked every 16 inches for the location of the studs that I'll be screwing onto this sill plate. I then figured out a measurement for the height of my studs and then cut those to length. I pre-drilled my sill plate for screws in all of the locations I'd be attaching a stud. Then I used my square before tightening things down. Since I don't have a top plate on this wall yet, I screwed on a brace across the front to secure the studs while I lift the wall in place in between the two steel columns. I needed to notch the top plate to clear the bolts holding the girder to the column. Once I had the top plate in place, I used a small drill bit to pre-drill the studs where I'd be driving screws through into the top plate. I made sure the stud was level before driving screws into the top plate, and then I repeated that process on each stud. Next, I started framing in the area around the electrical box, where I plan to build a box to allow access to the plugs and to protect the insulation on the back wall. Here I'm using my electric shear to cut down an extra piece of aluminum I have. It's an 090 thickness. My plan is to use my box brake and pan to create a really deep box or pan to protect the area around the electrical outlets and the insulation. Here I'm using my Eastwood 12-inch box brake and pan to put some really nice crisp bends into that aluminum piece. Because of the depth of this inset I needed to make, I had to make it in two pieces, which I'll pop rivet together. Here I'm drilling a hole where my pop rivet location needs to be. Once I get that one side pop riveted in place to hold the material there, then I'll go back and drill my second hole and put in that second pop rivet. Now I needed to finish the framing around the aluminum piece, which will hold it in place. Next, I used some self-tapping screws to hold the aluminum piece to the framing. I was now ready to put up my siding. I picked up these 8-foot corrugated metal panels at Lowe's. My plan is just to cut them in half and go 4 feet up with the corrugated metal and then put plywood above that. Here I'm using my DeWalt angle grinder with a cutting wheel on it. It cut like butter through 2 layers of this corrugated metal. After making sure the top of the siding was level, I used my self-tapping screws again to secure the siding to the studs and the sill plate. I worked my way across, making sure things were level and continuing the process to attach the siding to the studs. Lowe's also had this trim piece. I thought it would give it a nice finished look where the siding meets the plywood. With the trim piece level and slipped in behind the siding, I used my self-tapping screws to attach both pieces to the studs. The corner of the trim had a bit of a sharp piece, so I just used a file to clean that up and smooth it out. I probably should have done this earlier, but after making sure the wall was plumb, I drilled holes in the girder to allow me to drive screws down into the top plate. I continued that process along the length of the wall. Finally, coming down the home stretch, I was able to cut this 1/2-inch plywood to length for the upper section of the wall. I used a 2x4 clamped onto the plywood as a cutting guide, and my saw depth cut adjusted so that I didn't cut through my supports on the sawhorses. The plywood fit perfectly between the corrugated metal and the girder, so I went ahead and secured it to the studs with 1¼ inch screws. Now with the wall finished, I could finally organize this area of the shop just the way I wanted it. I also took the time to wire a much needed new power cord and install some new belts on this drill press. Thanks for watching.